War is usually remembered in terms of blood, loss, and sacrifice. The American Civil War was no exception. Over 600,000 lives lost, families torn apart, and entire regions devastated. Yet, alongside this immense suffering, there was another, less discussed reality. War created unprecedented opportunities for profit. While soldiers fought on the battlefield, a new class of industrialists and financiers was quietly reshaping the American economy. The Civil War was a turning point in the rise of modern American capitalism. The North, with its railroads, factories, and banks, transformed the chaos of war into a springboard for growth. Out of this era emerged powerful industries, immense fortunes, and the foundations of the Gilded Age. In this video, we'll explore who profited from the Civil War and how the conflict fueled the rise of Northern industry. From the booming railroad companies to steel magnates, textile manufacturers, and bankers, we'll uncover the individuals and industries that turned war into opportunity. And by the end, we'll see how a national tragedy also became the catalyst for America's industrial future. On the eve of the Civil War, the United States was a nation split by politics and ideology, and also by two very different economic systems. The North had already begun walking the path of industrialization. Cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston bustled with factories, machine shops, and ports that connected the U.S. to global trade. Railroads crisscrossed the region, banks and insurance companies grew rapidly, and a growing middle class thrived in this industrial economy. The South, on the other hand, remained largely agrarian. Its wealth and identity revolved around plantations, cotton fields, and, most importantly, enslaved labor. Cotton was king, and the South was proud of it. By 1860, the region was producing more than two-thirds of the world's cotton, exporting it primarily to British and French textile mills. This single crop fueled Southern prosperity and also global industry. Yet, beneath this prosperity was fragility. The Southern economy was dangerously dependent on a single product and an institution, slavery, that the North increasingly sought to contain or abolish. Early signs of Northern advantage were already evident. The North had built a far more diverse economy. Its industrial base produced textiles, iron, steel, machinery, firearms, and tools. Railroads connected towns and cities, allowing goods to move quickly across states and creating economic integration that the South lacked. By 1860, the North had more than 20,000 miles of railroad track, compared to just 9,000 in the South. The difference was more than just numbers. Northern lines formed a vast, interconnected network, while Southern lines were fragmented and often ended at ports, designed to move cotton rather than armies or manufactured goods. Banking and finance also tilted in the North's favor. Wall Street was already emerging as a financial center, with investment houses and commercial banks ready to fund infrastructure and trade. Insurance companies thrived in northern cities, protecting shipping ventures and industrial enterprises. By contrast, the South had few large banks and little capital invested in anything other than land and slaves. This left Southern elites rich on paper, but cash poor when it came to funding a long, modern war. Even population numbers revealed the imbalance. The North's population of about 22 million dwarfed the South's 9 million, and nearly half of those in the South were enslaved people who were denied basic rights and excluded from the military effort. The North could draw on a vast pool of free labor and soldiers, while also welcoming waves of immigrants from Europe who fueled its workforce. In short, by 1861, the North had the makings of an industrial giant, while the South remained tied to a vulnerable one-crop economy. The Civil War would test both systems to their limits. The South gambled that cotton and slavery could sustain independence. The North bet that industry, finance, and infrastructure would deliver victory. As history would show, the North's advantage was more than military. It was economic, and it would shape the future of America. When the first shots rang out at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the United States was suddenly thrown into a conflict on a scale it had never seen before. The Civil War was a test of whether an entire nation could mobilize its economy for total war. Almost overnight, demand exploded for weapons, uniforms, food, transportation, and every material needed to sustain hundreds of thousands of soldiers. For Northern industries, This was nothing short of an earthquake, shaking old patterns of trade and production, but also creating enormous opportunities. Muskets and rifles, once produced in modest numbers, were now ordered by the tens of thousands. Foundries that once built farm equipment pivoted to making cannons and ironclad warships. Textile mills worked day and night, producing uniforms, blankets, and tents. Railroads, which had been expanding before the war, suddenly became lifelines of the Union Army, moving troops, supplies, and equipment faster than ever imagined. Even farms in the Midwest were drawn into this whirlwind, sending grain, pork, and beef eastward to feed the armies in the field. The federal government, which had once been a relatively modest spender, suddenly became the biggest customer in the nation's history. War contracts poured into northern businesses, many of them awarded quickly and without oversight in the rush to supply the Union Army. This created a new model of wealth creation. Companies could rise or fall depending on whether they secured government contracts. For those who won them, fortunes were made almost overnight. But with opportunity came unethical behavior. The sudden influx of contracts opened the door to corruption, cutting corners and outright fraud. Unscrupulous suppliers sold uniforms that fell apart in the rain, rifles that misfired, and food that was spoiled before it even reached the front. Newspapers and politicians began to rail against what they called the shoddy aristocracy, men who got rich by delivering inferior goods to soldiers risking their lives. The term war profiteer entered the American vocabulary during this time, symbolizing the uneasy mix of patriotism and greed that war often produces. Yet not every profit was dirty. Many industrialists genuinely rose to the challenge, delivering quality goods at unprecedented speed. The sheer scale of mobilization forced businesses to innovate, invest in new machinery, and expand their workforces. The war created a massive transfer of resources, pulling the nation toward industrial modernity. Factories grew larger, railroad networks expanded, and banking systems evolved to handle the enormous flow of money. In just a few years, the Civil War had transformed the Union into something new, an economy where government, industry, and finance were deeply intertwined. While soldiers paid the cost in blood, industrialists and financiers in the North discovered that war, as terrible as it was, could also be the engine of extraordinary profit, and this was only the beginning. If there was one industry that symbolized the transformation of the Northern economy during the Civil War, it was the railroads. Before 1861, railways were already expanding rapidly, but the war supercharged this growth. The Union Army quickly realized that the ability to move men and supplies over vast distances could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Railroads became the arteries of the Northern war machine. Troops could now be transported in days instead of weeks. Cannons, rifles, and food were loaded into freight cars and sent directly to the front lines. When bridges were destroyed or tracks torn up by Confederate raids, construction crews rushed in behind the soldiers to rebuild them. Military necessity forced the Union to treat railroads not as private companies, but as critical infrastructure. At times, the government even seized direct control of certain lines to ensure efficiency. This urgency translated into enormous profits for railroad companies and their investors. The demand for locomotives, steel rails, and freight cars skyrocketed. Companies that supplied these materials, like iron and steel producers, thrived, while railroad executives secured lucrative contracts to keep trains running. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, already wealthy from his shipping empire, expanded their fortunes by moving aggressively into rail transport. Vanderbilt would later consolidate several major lines into one of the largest railroad networks in the country, setting the stage for his rise as one of America's most powerful tycoons. The war also pushed technological and organizational innovation. Timetables had to be coordinated to move massive armies, repair crews developed new methods to rebuild lines quickly, and logistics officers learned how to integrate rail transport with traditional wagon supply lines. These lessons became the foundation of a modern transportation system. By the time the guns fell silent in 1865, the North's railroad network had grown not only in size, but in strategic importance. Railroads had proven themselves indispensable to modern warfare and modern economics alike. Investors poured money into new projects, and within just a few years, ambitious ventures like the first transcontinental railroad were underway, an achievement that would have been unthinkable without the momentum of the war years. In the post-war era, railroad magnates became some of the richest and most influential men in America. Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Collis P. Huntington, and others built vast empires that shaped the economy of the Gilded Age. Their wealth and power often sparked controversy, with critics accusing them of monopolistic practices, corruption, and exploitation. But their dominance traced directly back to the Civil War, when the desperate need to move armies across the Union had turned railroads into gold mines. The Civil War transformed railroads into the backbone of the nation's economy. What began as a wartime necessity became, in peace, the vehicle of America's industrial expansion. If the Civil War was the first truly modern war, it was because of iron and steel. No longer was combat fought only with muskets and sabers. Now, mass-produced rifles, heavy artillery, armored ships, and endless miles of railroad tracks defined the battlefield. For Northern industry, this meant unprecedented demand and unprecedented profit. The Union's Navy launched one of the most dramatic innovations of the era, the ironclad warship. When the USS Monitor faced off against the Confederate Virginia, formerly the Merrimac, in 1862, the world saw that wooden fleets were becoming obsolete. Building these armored vessels required massive amounts of iron plating, engines, and industrial labor, needs the South simply could not meet. Foundries in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York churned out the materials, fueling not only the war effort but also the rise of an industrial infrastructure that would continue long after the conflict. Artillery was another key driver of demand. The Union Army fired millions of shells during the war, and producing cannons and ammunition at this scale required a steady stream of iron and steel. The Springfield Armory, one of the nation's oldest weapons manufacturers, scaled up production of rifled muskets, while private companies secured lucrative contracts to supply the Army. Rifles like the Spencer repeating gun, capable of firing multiple shots without reloading, demonstrated how innovation and mass production were changing warfare. Behind this surge in production stood ambitious industrialists. Men like Andrew Carnegie, who began his career working in railroads and iron, seized the moment. Carnegie invested in steelmaking during the war, and the profits he earned became the foundation of the empire he would later build. By mastering the supply of rails, bridges, and military equipment, these entrepreneurs turned the war into a launch pad for long-term dominance. The railroad boom also drove iron demand. Every new mile of track required tons of steel rails, spikes, and locomotives. The government's reliance on rail transport guaranteed steady business for ironworks. This symbiotic relationship between war and industry created a pattern that would repeat itself in future conflicts. Wars accelerated technological and industrial revolutions. By the time the war ended, the seeds of the Gilded Age had already been planted. The same foundries that had built cannons and warships now pivoted to civilian projects, bridges, skyscrapers, and expanded rail networks. The men who had risen to prominence by supplying the Union Army became the titans of post-war America, shaping industries that would dominate the late 19th century. The Civil War thus served as a brutal but effective catalyst. Iron and steel, demanded in staggering quantities, gave birth to fortunes and laid the groundwork for an age of industrial giants. While soldiers carried rifles into battle, the real machinery of war was being forged in the roaring furnaces of the North, a machinery that would keep turning long after the fighting had stopped. When the Union mobilized for war, it faced a logistical nightmare. How do you clothe and equip hundreds of thousands of soldiers almost overnight? Before 1861, the U.S. Army had been a relatively small professional force. Suddenly, with the call for mass enlistments, the North had to supply uniforms, boots, blankets, and tents on an industrial scale. This demand created both immense opportunities for Northern manufacturers and a new wave of corruption that shaped public opinion about wartime profiteering. Textile mills in New England, already leaders in cloth production, became the backbone of the Union's supply chain. Factories that had once produced clothing for civilians now shifted to manufacturing wool uniforms by the tens of thousands. Mechanization played a crucial role here. The spinning jenny, power looms, and sewing machines made it possible to standardize and accelerate production. What had once taken weeks by hand could now be completed in days. For the first time in American history, the federal government was driving demand for mass-produced clothing, and entire industries reshaped themselves around this need. Yet, with rapid mobilization came problems. Many contractors rushed to fill orders without regard for quality. Soldiers sometimes received uniforms made of shoddy, a cheap recycled fabric that fell apart after the first rain. Boots split open on long marches, and blankets provided little warmth in freezing weather. Such failures fueled outrage in the press, where journalists accused businessmen of getting rich while soldiers suffered. The phrase shoddy aristocracy was coined to describe these war profiteers, manufacturers who sacrificed durability for quick profit. Still, not every contract was a scandal. Many manufacturers rose to the challenge, scaling production and introducing efficiencies that would shape the textile industry for decades. The war accelerated the adoption of the sewing machine, allowing factories to mass-produce clothing with far fewer workers than before. In many ways, the Civil War marked the true beginning of America's garment industry, laying the foundation for the factory system that would dominate after the war. Government contracts themselves became a new form of wealth creation. Politicians and business owners forged close ties, with contracts often awarded to companies with the right connections rather than the best products. This overlap between politics and profit blurred the line between patriotism and opportunism. For some, the war was less about preserving the Union and more about securing the next lucrative deal. By the end of the conflict, the Union had managed to keep its armies clothed, but at a price, both financially and morally. The textile boom had shown how mechanization and industrial capacity could meet the demands of modern warfare, but it also exposed how easily greed could undermine quality. In this sense, the story of Union uniforms was the story of the war economy itself. Innovation mixed with exploitation, efficiency shadowed by corruption. While factories and railroads often take center stage in discussions of the Civil War economy, agriculture was just as vital, and in the North it underwent a transformation that set the stage for modern agribusiness. Feeding vast armies required a steady supply of grain, meat, and preserved food. The Union's ability to meet this demand depended not only on fertile farmland, but also on mechanization, which allowed farmers to produce more with fewer hands. By the 1860s, new machines were changing the landscape of northern farms. The McCormick reaper, invented a few decades earlier, now became essential. With this horse-drawn machine, a single farmer could harvest as much grain as a dozen men working by hand. Threshing machines, mechanical seed drills, and improved plows sped up every stage of farming, from planting to harvesting. The war gave these inventions a new urgency. With so many men leaving rural communities to join the army, farms needed machines to fill the labor gap. Mechanization became a necessity for survival. The demand for food skyrocketed. The Union Army needed enormous amounts of bread, pork, beef, beans, and corn to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Chicago, located at the crossroads of the Midwest's grain belt and the railroads, became a booming hub of meatpacking and food distribution. Entrepreneurs like Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift, who supplied meat to the Army, would go on to become giants of the post-war food industry. Their wartime experience in processing and shipping massive quantities of food laid the foundation for America's first true agribusiness empires. For northern farmers, the war years were often prosperous. High demand and government contracts meant good prices for grain and livestock. Railroads allowed farmers to reach markets in the East more efficiently than ever before. And while shortages of labor were real, the adoption of machinery meant many farmers could actually expand production, despite having fewer hands in the fields. The contrast with the South could not have been starker. Southern agriculture was devastated. Plantations that had once exported millions of bales of cotton were cut off by Union blockades. Fields were ravaged by battles, slaves escaped or were freed, and the South's transportation system collapsed under constant attack. While the North's farms adapted and thrived, the South's agrarian system crumbled, leaving widespread hunger and economic ruin. By the end of the war, Northern agriculture had been transformed into something far more efficient, commercial, and industrial in scale. The reliance on mechanization and large-scale production marked the beginnings of American agribusiness. Farmers who once worked primarily for local markets now fed armies and increasingly national markets. Just as iron and steel were reshaping industry, machines and markets were reshaping the farm, ensuring that agriculture too would emerge from the Civil War more powerful and profitable than before. If Northern factories were the muscles of the Union war effort, banks and financiers were its lifeblood. Wars are expensive, and the Civil War was by far the most expensive conflict America had faced. Supplying armies, building railroads, and purchasing weapons required sums of money the government simply did not have on hand. To survive, the Union turned to Northern banks and financiers, and in doing so, reshaped the nation's financial system. At the start of the war, the federal government relied heavily on loans. Banks in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia pooled millions of dollars to buy government bonds, giving Lincoln's administration the cash it needed to keep armies in the field. Bonds offered interest, and financiers knew that a Union victory would mean repayment, while failure would mean ruin. Supporting the war, then, was both a patriotic gamble and a chance for massive profit. One of the most revolutionary steps taken was the introduction of paper money, known as greenbacks. Before the war, Americans dealt mostly in gold, silver, or banknotes issued by private banks. In 1862, the U.S. government began printing its own paper currency, backed not by gold but by the government's promise. It was a bold move, designed to stabilize wartime finances and keep money flowing through the economy. Greenbacks changed the way Americans thought about money, laying the foundation for a centralized financial system. Equally important was the creation of the national banking system in 1863. This system brought regulation and order to what had been a chaotic banking landscape. Nationally chartered banks were required to hold U.S. bonds as reserves, tying their success directly to the federal government's credit. In return, they could issue stable national banknotes. This not only funded the war, but also gave the Union a more uniform and reliable currency system, something the South, with its fractured banking structure, never achieved. Speculators thrived in this environment. Men like Jay Cooke became famous as financial masterminds of the war, organizing mass bond sales that appealed to ordinary citizens as well as wealthy elites. Cooke's campaigns convinced thousands of Americans to invest in the Union cause, turning patriotism into a financial instrument. Others, however, played less noble roles, betting on fluctuations in currency or manipulating markets to their advantage. For the financial elite of the North, the war was a chance to cement dominance. Wall Street grew in importance, and the connections between government and big banks deepened. By the end of the war, financiers had proven themselves as indispensable to national power as generals on the battlefield. The Civil War did more than save the Union. It gave birth to modern American capitalism, where industry and finance were inseparable partners in both war and peace. Wars often decide who will dominate the economy for generations to come. The Civil War was no different. While hundreds of thousands of ordinary Americans paid in blood, a handful of Northern businessmen used the conflict as a springboard into wealth and power. Out of the smoke of war emerged a new class of elites, industrialists and financiers, who would soon be known as the giants of the Gilded Age. Take Andrew Carnegie, for example. Before the war, Carnegie was a young immigrant working in the telegraph industry and railroads. During the war, he oversaw military rail transport and invested in ironworks that supplied rails and bridges to the Union Army. His wartime profits allowed him to expand rapidly, and after the war, he turned to steel, building an empire that would make him one of the richest men in the world. The Civil War gave Carnegie the resources and experience that fueled his rise. Then there was J.P. Morgan, who would later become the most powerful banker in America. During the war, Morgan's firm arranged massive government bond sales, connecting the Union's need for capital with wealthy investors eager for returns. He also dabbled in arms dealing, famously purchasing thousands of old rifles, refurbishing them cheaply, and reselling them to the government at a hefty profit. While the scandal tarnished his reputation briefly, it demonstrated the new reality. Finance, when tied to war, could be immensely profitable. These men, and others like them, rose while the Southern elite fell. Planters who had once dominated American wealth through land and slaves saw their fortunes vanish. Cotton exports collapsed, plantations were destroyed, and emancipation wiped away their labor system. The very foundation of Southern wealth, slavery, was gone, while Northern elites had leveraged the war to build industries that would only grow stronger. The Civil War, then, was more than a battlefield contest between North and South. It was a massive transfer of economic power. Old money rooted in land and slavery gave way to new money rooted in industry, railroads, and banking. The war created a new economic order led by men whose fortunes had been forged in wartime. They would go on to dominate the Gilded Age, shaping America's future with wealth that had its origins in the blood and chaos of the 1860s. Wherever there is sudden government spending, corruption is never far behind. The Civil War poured billions of dollars into contracts for food, clothing, weapons, and transportation. And while many businesses rose to the challenge with efficiency and innovation, others saw the war as a chance to cut corners and cash in at the expense of soldiers on the front lines. While the North turned war into an engine of industrial growth, the South faced the opposite reality: economic collapse. Southern elites had long built their fortunes on cotton, slavery, and land. But when war came, that narrow economic base proved to be a fatal weakness. Unlike their northern counterparts, Southern planters and businessmen were unable to adapt, and instead of profiting from the war, they watched their wealth disintegrate. The Confederacy placed its faith in King Cotton. Southern leaders believed that Europe, especially Britain and France, was so dependent on Southern cotton for their textile industries that foreign governments would intervene on their behalf. Confident in this strategy, Southern elites hoarded their cotton in the early years of the war, refusing to export it in hopes of forcing Europe's hand. But the gamble failed. The Union's naval blockade strangled Southern ports, cutting off access to international markets. Meanwhile, Britain and France turned to other suppliers, such as Egypt and India, reducing their dependence on Southern cotton. The result was catastrophic. The South's primary source of wealth dried up almost overnight. Beyond the blockade, the war devastated Southern agriculture. Plantations became battlegrounds, crops were burned, and enslaved people fled or were liberated as Union forces advanced. Without enslaved labor, the plantation system collapsed. Southern planters, who had once been among the wealthiest elites in the world, found themselves cash poor, unable to maintain their estates, and with little means to rebuild. Unlike northern farmers, who turned to mechanization and new markets, the South clung to outdated methods, leaving them unable to adapt to wartime conditions. Industrial capacity in the South was minimal to begin with. While the North had railroads, factories, and banks, the Confederacy had only a handful of ironworks and almost no infrastructure to support large-scale manufacturing. Southern railroads, sparse and poorly connected, quickly broke down under the strain of military transport. With little iron or coal production to repair them, the transportation system collapsed, further crippling the South's ability to supply its armies. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the battlefield fell silent, but the economic revolution it had unleashed only grew louder. The war had forced the Union to industrialize at a pace never seen before, and once the shooting stopped, the machinery of war shifted into the machinery of peace. Wartime industries, railroads, steel, textiles, and finance were transformed into the foundations of post-war monopolies that would dominate the American economy during the Gilded Age. The Civil War also accelerated America's transition into an industrial superpower. With agriculture mechanized, factories expanded, and railroads stretching further west, the United States was poised to outproduce many European nations within a generation. By the 1880s, the U.S. was not only self-sufficient, but increasingly dominant in steel, oil, and manufacturing. The war had proven that mass production, government contracts, and national markets could drive extraordinary growth. In essence, the Union victory was also a victory for industrial capitalism. But this transformation came with a price. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a few sparked intense debates about inequality and corporate power. Workers in factories and on railroads often endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and low pay, while industrialists amassed fortunes of almost unimaginable scale. Strikes and labor movements, such as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, were direct outgrowths of this imbalance. The same railroads that had fed Union armies now became flashpoints of conflict between labor and capital. Moreover, the close relationship between government and big business, forged during the Civil War, set a precedent for corporate influence in politics. Critics argued that the war had handed too much power to wealthy industrialists. This tension, between the promise of economic growth and the peril of unchecked corporate power, would shape American society for decades. So, who profited from the Civil War? The answer is complex. While soldiers and their families paid the terrible cost in blood, disease, and destruction, Northern industrialists, financiers, and farmers found themselves at the heart of an economic transformation. Railroads stretched further, factories expanded, farms became mechanized, and banks gained new power. Men like Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan used the war as a springboard into fortunes that would dominate the Gilded Age. In contrast, the Southern elite, once among the richest in the world, saw their wealth evaporate as slavery collapsed and cotton lost its crown. The irony of the Civil War is that it was both a national tragedy and a catalyst for modern capitalism. On one hand, it left a scar that still runs through American history: over 500,000 dead, entire regions devastated, and a society struggling to heal. On the other hand, it accelerated the forces of industrialization and finance that would propel the United States into the modern age. War had revealed the potential of industry to supply, innovate, and profit on a massive scale. And when the guns finally fell silent, those industries were too powerful and too profitable to fade away. In the end, the Civil War proved that even in the darkest of times, opportunity exists for those willing to seize it. The profits of war were uneven, controversial, and often tainted by corruption, but they set the stage for America's rise as an industrial superpower.